Peppa clears her throat before telling her family what she put in her dairy. Mr. Potato clears his throat before calling for Super Potato candy. Cat clears her throat before singing Hey Diddle Diddle. Mummy Pig clears her throat before reading her Funny Onion story. Madam Gazelle clears her throat before saying her poem. Dr. Hamster clears her throat before announcing the winner of the best pet competition. Pedro Pony clears his throat before making a glass of water disappear. Peppa Pig clears her throat before yodeling on the top of the mountain. Mummy Dog clears her throat before appreciating Grandpa Pig and Captain Dog for a pirate game. Mr. Rabbit clears his throat before showing the Pig family the tour around Daddy Pig's office. Susie Sheep clears her throat before intimating a lion. Mr. Zebra clears his throat before telling everyone the rest of the bedtime story. Peppa Pig clears her throat before making an announcement to the whole airshow. Peppa Pig clears her throat before telling her news on her own television. Daddy Pig clears his throat before intimating a cuckoo. Rebecca Rabbit clears her throat before saying thank you for the school play. Peppa Pig clears her throat before announcing the winner of the fancy dress contest. Edmund Elephant clears his throat before telling George and Richard a bedtime story. Daddy Pig clears his throat before telling the elevator where to go. Cinderella clears her throat before saying the magic words. Bar clears her throat before warming up to sing The Farmer in the Dell. Super Grover clears his throat before singing his own version of If You're Happy and You Know It. Laa clears her throat before playing the trumpet. Laa clears her throat before singing to Make the Rug Clean. SpongeBob clears his throat before singing his own theme song. Sheep clears her throat before waking Egg up. Billy's dad clears his throat before telling Billy to wash his hands. Toby clears his throat before singing Rain Rain Go Away. A Star clears his throat before telling everyone facts about stars. Ben clears his throat before counting down from 3 to get to the other side of the bridge. Parker clears her throat before reading her animals poem. Captain Seasalt clears his throat before announcing that they landed. One of the students in Miss McMere's class clears his throat before singing the Salty Bear song. Olaf clears his throat before singing A Christmas Carol. A Man clears his throat before singing his scale Playhouse. Disney Clay clears his throat before singing the ABC song. Marvy clears his throat before telling a joke. Barney Live in New York City announcer clears his throat before welcoming everybody to the show. Seg clears his throat before telling everyone about the new Roblox death sound. Gary as a Man clears his throat before saying his poem. Alphablock Q clears her throat before singing I Need You. 3 people clear their throats before yodeling. Google Home clears her throat before singing the ABC song. Tony clears his throat before reading his True and the Rainbow Kingdom story. Little Bo Peep clears her throat before reading Bar. Black Sheep. Freud clears his throat before taking the Ghost's order. A Puppet clears his throat before reading his poem to Zhao Tian. An iguana clears his throat before singing his karaoke song. Bird clears his throat before reading his list of his favorite socks. Cookie Monster clears his throat before imitating the Count. Steve clears his throat before reading a story about him and Blue. Big Bird clears his throat before reading his son poem. Cookie Monster clears his throat before reading a snack clue. Big Bird clears his throat before pronouncing the word Abdefgajgalnopgrastuvx's. Grover clears his throat before reading an animal clue. Elmo clears his throat before calling for Mr. Noodle. Mother Goose clears her throat before reading her newest nursery rhyme. A Crab clears his throat before singing his own version of Head, Shoulders, Knees and Toes. Olivia clears her throat before singing in a really high note. Abby clears her throat before doing a spell on Canteen. Goofy clears his throat before announcing the Doggy games. Steve clears his throat before reading Hey Diddle Diddle. A teacher clears her throat before introducing Isaac to school. A librarian clears his throat before reading a magic mirror book. Plankton clears his throat before singing to Karen. Abby clears her throat before singing her own version of Five Little Ducks. Big clears his throat before reading a story about the first day of spring. Ruby clears her throat before singing a high C note. Quasi clears his throat before singing his pirate song. Small clears his throat before calling for Big to see the thing that cures hiccups. LL1 clears her throat before welcoming everybody to the land of lotus lovers. Love Monster clears his throat before announcing the winner of the Harvest Day contest. Miss Grizzle Sniff clears her throat before reading a story. Bevel clears his throat before singing Pop Goes the Weasel. Pocoyo Narrator clears his throat before reading Pocoyo's story. Pocoyo Narrator clears his throat before announcing the Pocoyo Olympics. Dodge clears his throat before singing the 12 Days of Christmas. Chili clears her throat before reading Bluey a bedtime story. Abney clears his throat before performing a magic trick on sawing teal in half. Tessa clears her throat before reading a Fairy tale Clarabelle clears her throat before singing a song to help Mickey get the golden heart. Baby Redbird clears his throat before tweeting. Mommy Redbird clears her throat before tweeting. Clarabelle clears her throat before calling for Toodles. DHX Media clears his throat before singing I Wanna Be in Your World. Bert clears his throat before singing his line of the Christmas pageant. Ray clears his throat before announcing the Alphablock he chose in his mind. Mr. Tumble clears his throat before doing the magic. Mr. Tumble clears his throat before making a toy rabbit disappear. Karen clears her throat before sheeshing. Cookie Monster clears his throat before reading his favorite Christmas story. Abby clears her throat before changing the shape of the checkers. A Black Sheep clears his throat before bleating. Little Miss Muffet clears her throat before screaming. Elmo clears his throat before presenting the number of the day with Abby. A Monkey Doctor clears his throat before saying no more monkeys jumping on the bed. A Cow clears his throat before telling a joke. Elder Kitten clears his throat before making an announcement. Robbie Rotten clears his throat before singing and breaking glass. Sophia clears her throat before singing the Enchantion National Anthem. A Roblox Girl clears her throat before singing like Simon Cowell. Biff clears her throat before singing Oh Christmas Tree. Aunt Polly clears her throat before singing Polly Put the Kettle on. Justin clears his throat before singing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. Number Block 40 clears his throat before changing to Number Block 50 while counting to 50. Lester clears his throat before waking the farm animals up. Elmo clears his throat before telling his news. Mr. Trollser clears his throat before answering a riddle. A Troll clears his throat before whispering nap time. Squacky clears his throat before reading a book. Katie and Toby clear their throats before singing Oh Canada Love Monster clears his throat before presenting the mystery package. J Party clears his throat before announcing the best collaboration. King Wordy clears his throat before making an announcement. Marvy clears his throat before singing a lullaby. Marvy clears his throat before reading his Mother's Day poem. Milo clears his throat before reading his Father's Day book. Milo clears his throat before singing Bing. Oh Milo clears his throat before singing Hot Cross Buns. Rosita clears her throat before telling everyone the Spanish word of the day. A Ringmaster clears his throat before welcoming Elmo to the circus. Cookie Monster clears his throat before reading a Love Monster story. The Ollibob Top Narrator clears his throat before singing Plip Plop. Owl clears his throat before waking Meg up. A toy version of Susie Sheep clears her throat before singing a song. Face clears his throat before singing his goodbye song. Face clears his throat before singing his song about his vegetable garden. SpongeBob clears his throat before singing Dear Friend. Zoe's dad clears his throat before reading Jingle Jangle Days Eve. Daddy Lion clears his throat before reading Because a Little Bug Went Cuckoo. Quack clears his throat before making his leaving announcement. CK clears her throat before reading Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Ruffman clears his throat before answering a question. Shark Dog clears his throat before barking. Ruby clears her throat before singing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. Lulu clears her throat before singing her song. Tib clears his throat before translating Outer Space. Ish Crunch clears her throat before announcing the tidiest person in the forest. Popcorn clears his throat before telling Vida a joke. Fergie clears her throat before leading the band. Popcorn clears his throat before telling Vida that it's time to go to Sweetwood. Popcorn clears his throat before telling Toby that it's time for an eye test. Cricket clears his throat before vocalizing. Frida clears her throat before singing On the Seven Seas. Pinocchio clears his throat before singing Summer Has Just Begun. Captain Barnacles clears his throat before telling Quasi to activate Creature Report. Duncan clears his throat before asking the other kids a question. Mr. Tumble as a lord clears his throat before singing operatically. Mickey Mouse clears his throat before singing Oh Solo Mini. Mickey Mouse clears his throat before announcing that it's his birthday. Mr. Fisher clears his throat before croaking. Toopy clears his throat before telling a scary story to help Banu cure his hiccups. Maya Go clears her throat before singing her scales for her concert. Ruby clears her throat before presenting her movie A Perfect Day in the Life of Me. Elmo clears his throat before scaring the pigeons. Toby clears his throat before saying the tongue twister. Peter Piper, Milo and Toby clear their throats before singing Are You Sleeping in English and French. Katie and Toby clear their throats before starting sing along with Toby. Abby clears her throat before turning a pumpkin into a royal carriage. Gina clears her throat before reading a bedtime story to Marco. Abby clears her throat before turning a violin into a pumpkin. Abby clears her throat before doing a spell on attach. Abby clears her throat before reading to Marco. Toby clears her throat before asking Katie to spell the word snow. Oakley clears his throat before reading Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Clarabelle clears her throat before reading her lines for a play The Very Important Lady. clears her throat before singing her scale. Chris clears his throat before initiating a ringmaster.